with 6 races living together.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion, with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building. Globespan believes that every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diasporas and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana.
Coffee and Dr. Jagan, Bobby, she gave us our great sons. Rohan Kanhai, Coffee and Dr. Jagan.
As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adopt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
Land of many waters with 6 races living together.
A very special welcome to all of our listeners at Globespan Television here in New York. Tonight we have the agent for the Guyana at the ICJ, Mr. Carl Greenidge, who will explain to us the recent developments in Trinidad and where we go from there. But before we embark on that, I want to say thanks to Noir Singh for making this program available to all our listeners far and wide, and to Ryan Gobin and Devin Bissoon, our technical producers. Thank you, guys. Now, Mr. Greenidge, welcome to the program for the second time in 7 weeks.
Hello, Dr. Rose. Thank you.
Now,
Thank you and your listeners.
Okay. Now, we know what's going on and what Venezuela is doing. And you have been dealing with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, for the longest while. But Mr. Greenidge, sometimes I don't understand the court and I do not understand bureaucracy. I say that to tell you that on October 3rd, 1899, the arbitral agreement settled the border dispute. It also established a mixed boundary commission. It's called a Mixed Boundary Venezuela British Commission. It was established in 1905 between the two countries to demarcate the border between the two countries. The border map, as it was called, was reissued in 1911 and 1917 at the request of Venezuela's then president, Juan Vicente Gomez, who agreed with the decision, and his foreign affairs minister, Mr. Ali Cantara, signed the agreement. So all this is evidence that the then president of Venezuela agreed to the agreement. So my question to you, Mr. Greenidge, why the ICJ is taking so long to arbitrate this case and settle it once and for all? You had a case with them in April of this year. Why can't they set a date and finish this case off?
Well, they can't set a date to finish the case off in the manner that you like, but they are moving reasonably quickly. Let me just say this to you, that we recognize that in any court, you have two parties plus the court. And as procedures go, and these are not only legal procedures, but administratively, you always have to recognize that rules do allow, in a way, for abuse. And that is, in a sense, is what has happened, but that is not why we are quite where we are now. In other words, the preliminary objections that Venezuela lodged were permitted. Those preliminary objections were permitted. You might think, well, they ought not to have been permitted. They were permitted and wrongly rejected. And now we are going forward. But what has happened at this most recent turn is that Venezuela in the course of the presentations by its president, and also an announcement from the Electoral Commission indicated that Venezuela was proposing to have a referendum. Now, the referendum is proposing to deal with questions, particularly questions 1, 3, and 5, which directly either attack the ICJ or seek to preempt or undermine any decision taken by the ICJ, as well as to pose a hazard to Guyana, bearing in mind that this was the agreement of 1899 gave us and Venezuela borders that we agreed and have worked with for 61 years. As a consequence of that, the government of Guyana has called upon the court to protect it, in a sense, from this hazard. And we did so last week only, just to say to you, or just to indicate to you, that the court, when the circumstances warrant it, can react expeditiously. So having spoken to them last Tuesday, the court has now responded, or it responded the following day by publishing a notice of Guyana's complaint, and its call for provisional measures. Okay, and the date that they have set for the hearing will be either 14th or the 15th of this very month. So we have no complaint with the speed of their response in this particular matter. I think what one has to understand, and you will know this perhaps better than most of us, that is that municipal law is one thing. It may be complicated, but in the case of international law, issues and rights may be more complicated. And so the court does take time to study the submissions made to it and to explore the implications of the cases submitted to it, which I think, of course, makes their examination longer than normal. And then on top of that, you have requirements that the judges each give a written opinion and all of that. And bear in mind, they work in different languages. I've had the good fortune or misfortune to have worked in two institutions that operate in one case 2 languages, in the other case 3 or 4 languages. And I can assure you that that process adds considerably to the time taken to even communicate. You know, you can't just distribute a document if it comes in 1 language. You can't distribute it in 2 languages. To get it into the 3rd and 4th languages requires a multiplicity of translators, and it becomes very, very tricky. So one must make allowances for that. The process has taken long, and it has caused Guyanese to be asking, as you were asking, why is this exercise taking so long? I think the court has tried in the past to avoid Venezuela trying to undermine the standing and credibility of the proceedings by giving Venezuela room. I think that is part of the reality that we face. You don't really want, as a court, to be sitting and going through the sort of craziness that we just, I think, heard on the news in relation to the US, the Attorney General facing Donald Trump. You really would like, as far as possible, for these to be amicable arrangements so that when a decision is made, countries have difficulty distancing themselves from the decision. That is my response.
Mr. Greenwich,
sir.
The case is scheduled to come before the court. Who has to ask the court to set a time or a date? The Guyana government, or the court will do that by itself?
No, the court has set a date for the hearing. In
I'm
response
I'm
to,
not talking about the referendum hearing, which is set for the 14th of this month.
okay, or the
I'm
15th.
talking about the case, the border dispute case to settle it.
Well, the date has been set. The court at its last sitting called upon Venezuela to submit its memorial, that is refuting Guyana's own memorial, by the 8th of March, I think.
Okay.
And the problem here will be whether Venezuela responds or how it responds. In other words, it is possible for a country to then come back to the court and say, look, we can't make it. We've seen a number of cases in which countries have fired their entire legal teams or claim to have fired their entire legal teams in a bid to get extra time. So there are many tricks, and we have to be prepared for that. And the court, I am sure, must be alert to the risks of such behavior.
What led to the 1966 Geneva Agreement? Did the Border regime agree to discuss or negotiate the agreement there and then with Venezuela?
The 1966 agreement had been the subject of discussions between Britain and Venezuela, and they arose because Venezuela was threatening to take unilateral action to, how would one say, to redefine the borders according to how they believe what they believe they deserved. And so Britain went through a long process trying to persuade them not to go in that route. And Britain also had refused to renegotiate the arbitral award. So Venezuela eventually was persuaded, look, you think that there was something improper going on, we will open the books to you. And as part of that opening of the books, the mixed commission that was established by the two sides during the negotiation of the Geneva Agreement, that mixed commission was established, and it met for 4 years. And Venezuela could not find information to justify the claim of fraud or improper behavior. But the discussions, you can say, discussions were going on from 62 until 66. Britain was not prepared to provide Guyana with the sort of protection that they had offered to Belize. That is to base a squadron of jets, the Kestrel, which would have been capable of fighting other fighter aircraft, that sort of air defense, but also capable of bombing ground troops. They weren't prepared to provide that to us. And for that reason, Guyana found itself, I think, forced to come to some arrangement under which Venezuela would have no excuse to launch any military attacks against Guyana.
Okay. If or when the ICJ made its ruling, and I strongly believe, based on the facts, that Guyana will prevail in this ruling. But the question is, if Venezuela does not accept, as Maduro clearly stated, he will not accept any decision made by the ICJ, because according to him, the ICJ is biased towards Guyana. So if the ICJ, if the Maduro regime or the Venezuelan government, whoever is the president, does not accept the decision, what's next?
Well, first of all, many countries have in the past, since 45, when the court has been meeting, there have been 100 and odd cases, and many of those countries involved have refused to accept the decision of the court. Over time, however, one has found that a reducing number a decreasing number of countries have taken that position. And even a place like Nigeria, in its border dispute with Cameroon, which it swore it would never embrace, I was very surprised in the last couple of years to see that they had accepted the ruling and had promised to implement it. So in a sense, there is still room for diplomatic work in that regard. But in the end, if the Venezuelans decide to defy the court, then Guyana could take them to the either the General Assembly or the Security Council. Now, that is not a route that we would want to use as a first resort, but it is still available to us. But before you get there, there's still a lot of bilaterals to be done with friendly states to try and persuade them to persuade Venezuela, and also to try and persuade them to take action against Venezuela. You know, one could work with the EU, work with the US, you can work with various regional groupings to see that that is done. And of course, the main work will be to discourage Venezuela from taking any military action that they might like to justify on basis of the referendum.
Here, my other question to you, and I'm being very provocative here. I know Guyana, the United States is friendly to Guyana, Guyana is friendly to the United States. Venezuela is not as friendly to the United States or the United States, but they have some relationship going on.
And there have been strong links to the US in the past. Yes, I agree with that part.
But the US releasing the tension now because of oil and so forth, and especially with the war with Ukraine and so forth. But my question to you is this. The United States has the authority to tell Venezuela that if you only crawl into Guyana's territory, we will defend Guyana. In order to avoid a war on people, why the United States cannot, of anyone in the government asked the United States to come out and say something like this?
Well, normally, one doesn't go that far. And even in the case of the US, for it to make that sort of statement, it would be the result of some extreme impropriety on Venezuela's part. I think this is soft diplomacy and harder diplomacy. But there are ways of telling a country, don't do A, because it will have consequences that you wouldn't like. And I believe that the government of Guyana is aware of the threat that it faces, is aware that it would be catastrophic to sit and allow Venezuela to take military action, because you will not be able to correct that, or at least you wouldn't be able to correct it easily. And so I think that they know they have to work hard on the US in particular in that regard. But also there are other countries with an interest in avoiding that situation. Brazil, for example, I think would be extremely upset if that were to happen for all sorts of reasons. I just know that was not be, and from a conversation I myself had with the last Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Okay, why I raise that question is because the United States represented Venezuela in the 1899 arbitral award.
Yes.
Britain represented the Guyana at the time, British Guyana at the time, yes. And you had the Russians there to judge. I'm saying the United States accepted the decision on behalf of Venezuela, which Venezuela agreed to. I just mentioned to you, Juan Vicente Gomez in 1819 agreed to the decision. So why the US is going to wait until bloodshed then try to come and correct the situation. I don't understand that type of diplomacy or on political maneuvering.
Well, I don't expect the US to be aware of any impending action by Venezuela and to just sit quietly. I don't expect it to do that. The US has the capacity, more than most other countries, or probably more than any other country, to anticipate aggressive military moves by Venezuela, simply because of the equipment it has, the proximity it has, and the connections it has with the Venezuelan military. So two things one would expect to happen. One, that they would talk to Venezuela, as they do when they need to for their own purposes. And secondly, that they would signal to Guyana so that we are not caught with our pants down, as it were. But in any case, we don't have military hardware or even the people, that software side, to really confront Venezuela if a sudden attack were made. So we have to work with these allies, US, Brazil, and many others, including the Commonwealth.
I agree with that, but here's my other question to you. And this is based on my opinion. Personally, I do not think Venezuela will ever invade Guyana. Maduro is just a rattle rouser because he knows the election is next year and he wants to look strong and powerful at home. So he called a referendum. But having said that, Guyana has to be on its guard. Because if Guyana don't, then, it will be more problems for Guyana. But yes, as I said, I don't think Maduro is going to be that irrational. Given what's happening to any country that tried to invade a country, Russia tried to invade the Ukraine. Look at the repellent it's getting. So that's my personal opinion. But what do you think, Mr. Greenwich?
Well, I think that at this point in time, Venezuela still is probably still thinking of what to do by way of a follow-up of its threat. I don't know, but I would have to give you a definitive answer would be not my business, but the military and the intelligence personnel here in Guyana. And they would have to consult with others, their allies outside of these borders. And I'm not aware that they've had any definitive reaction from our allies. But it would appear to be a most incredible, bizarre action on the part of Venezuela, given that at every turn they have failed. They try to deal with this on the legal front. They try to bully their way on the diplomatic front. So on the military front, it may have consequences that they don't want to take on.
I say that to tell you to raise this question. Now, if a country wants to invade another country, I've never read, I've never heard, or I've never seen where that country calls for a national referendum in this country to determine whether they should invade or not. So I think Maduro is just playing a game here. Because if he wants to invade, why would he ask the people to say, well, to give him the response that he wants to invade Guyana? What I haven't seen it in history. I haven't seen any country that did that.
No, I agree with you. This is not normal, and as a colleague just pointed out to us a minute ago, if you need the strength of a referendum behind you, you would normally ask the affected people. You're not going to ask. You're not going to ask the Venezuelans whether they would like you to seize the gold mines and oil wealth of Guyana and expect them to say no. Normally, you would ask the people from Essequibo, with all those gold mines and and oil resources, would you like to change your nationality, either by going across the border or by inviting the neighbor to take you over? It is a very bizarre case we're looking at, and everybody agrees that.
With the planned referendum coming up, I know the Guyana government asked for a date and they set a date for the 14th. What role you're playing in that, or the lawyers? What is there to argue?
Oh, one has to persuade the court, and the court has agreed. At this point in time, the court is offering to have the case over 2 days, the 14th and 15th.
Right.
And the idea is that Guyana will apprise the court of the implications and the conclusions it has drawn from Venezuela's behavior since the 23rd in particular. The statements by the president, statements by the military, actions by the military, which are causing alarm, causing worry in Guyana, will force Guyana now to take measures to try and provide comfort to Guyanese. It'll cause Guyana to be running around the place trying to get allies and to get military equipment and support. These things we will draw to the court's attention. Also to say to the court's attention, to the extent that these fellows are serious, if they take action based upon the referendum, then it is not going to be possible to undo the damage that such action, whether it is full action or partial action, it's not going to be easy, if at all possible, to undo the damage. And therefore, we call upon you, the court, to point out to Venezuela that they should not take any steps at all to change or to seek to change their constitutional arrangements in a bid to absorb or to attract Guyanese, such as providing them with ID cards and the like. It should not take any of the actions that seem designed to change the status of the Essequibo, and all of those things. It's the full spectrum of things we're going to be asking them not to do, asking them to make it very clear to the Venezuelans that it would not be acceptable under international law, it would not be accepted by the court, and that will be our responsibility in the court beginning on Tuesday.
Do you think the ICJ could make a ruling that could cause Venezuela to abandon or cancel the referendum?
Well, the fact that they are saying to Venezuela unequivocally that this is illegal ought, in circumstances of rationality, to convince Venezuela not to go ahead with this, or to modify it in some way that doesn't infringe or pose such a threat to Guyana. But it's hard to tell, because Venezuela's allies and Venezuela itself must know that all that's being done here is illegal, and they keep referring to the Geneva Agreement. Nowhere in the Geneva Agreement, least of all in Article 5, does it provide for or allow for or permit Venezuela to take such action. It explicitly forbids this. So one would hope that they will see sense, having gone to the brink, they will see sense and deviate from this path.
Guyana has the backing and support of the entire international community in this case. The United States, Brazil, the Commonwealth of Nations, the Organization of American States, the Organization of African Unity, and our neighbors, CARICOM. Can none of these regional bodies try to convince Venezuela to abandon its route?
Well, I can't say whether all of them have approached Venezuela. What we could do, of course, is to try and persuade them to send some envoys, maybe alongside our own people, to go speak to Venezuela. That is a possibility.
I asked you the question before if there have been direct communication with the United States, but let me rephrase that question. Has there been any effort made by the government to contact the United States and ask the United States for the full support, military or otherwise?
Well, I know that there have been discussions with the United States. The nature of the support they've sought, apart from the diplomatic support, I can't give you a definitive answer on. And that is simply because I don't know. It's an unfolding situation. You, for example, have a new ambassador. They're talking to the new ambassador. They would have spoken to Mr. Blinken some time ago, more than once. And those issues would have been put to them, I'm sure.
President Maduro has been all over the place seeking some sort of help to get, he sought from the Arab states. I don't think they want to get involved. He has asked the member states of CARICOM to be a mediator in the dispute. I think they don't want to, I think they turn him down. He has tried to seek a direct bilateral communication with President Ali. I think that will not happen, and President Ali is wise not to make that happen as well. Now, but he does not want the ICJ to settle the dispute. Do you think Venezuela know that it has a very, very weak case?
Yes.
And that will prevail?
Long time. That has been the case for a long time. If you see some comments by some former foreign ministers, for example, you will see them saying that Venezuela's case is weak. And you will also see them criticizing the strategy. Even the people who now form part of the advisory bodies to Venezuela, some of them were saying that some of the strategy is foolish. This has been said. So this is a case of a very stubborn administration, yielding in the last few months to their critics, but still pursuing the path that they set out on from the very beginning, notwithstanding the dangers that people have pointed out to them.
Next week is a case with the ICJ over the planned referendum.
Yes.
Has Venezuela been invited by the ICJ?
Venezuela has been asked to make a response to Guyana's comments.
And you don't know if they did?
No, they will also have the opportunity to make an oral presentation. At this point in time, we've seen no written response.
Okay. Now, Mr. Greenidge, I know you've been very busy with this case, the Venezuela recent threats and everything else. And I can understand why Venezuela is doing this, because many people said it because of the oil, the 10 or 11 or 12 billion barrels of oil found there. But as you know, Venezuela has been doing this before oil was even found in Guyana. But the oil, because of the oil, they ramp up their threats against Guyana. Now, if you can tell our listeners one good thing that the Guyana government has done, I know they have done many, but tell us one good thing the Guyana government has done to let the world know that Venezuela is a major threat not only to Guyana's security, not only to Guyana's stability, but also to the entire Caribbean.
Well, in recent times, and I think with increased urgency recently, they have started to work on the PR side in terms of printed publications. You're going to see some come out and being made available. I think that on the international front you're asking about, they are going to be appointing some ambassadors. Now I'm speaking out of turn here. You would have seen the announcement that somebody has been identified as the ambassador designate to Caracas. This is very important because part of the dialogue has to take place at that level. Part of the dialogue has to take place at that level. And that is also a way of gauging the mood of Venezuela and anticipating perhaps unhelpful behavior. Presumably, you will see similar action taken in relation to Brazil and maybe elsewhere in Latin America.
So far, everything has failed. Venezuela still continues to maintain its claim. As you know, can you explain to our listeners when the United Nations offered both countries to use the good offices? Explain to our listeners what is meant by the good offices and why Venezuela rejected that.
No, Venezuela didn't reject the good offices offered by the United Nations. When the United Nations was approached in 2015, I don't know if you're going back that far,
yes.
by Guyana, or 2014 by the PPP, 2015 by Guyana, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, responded by inviting the two presidents to meet with him. They met with him in September of 2015. At that point, he said, this is a legal issue and it has to be resolved by legal means. But if you are willing, if you have the interests of the Caribbean and our people at heart, you should talk. And he called for another year of talks and dialogue. That year passed and we didn't get anywhere, and he called for an additional year of dialogue. And the additional year of dialogue encountered problems at the beginning because 6 different persons were identified to facilitate that good office process. And all those names were rejected by President Maduro. And therefore, what Mr. Ban Ki-moon and the current SG, Mr. Gutierrez, decided was to choose someone. Since you couldn't get Venezuela's agreement in the appointment of someone, they chose Doug Newlander, who, as it happens, was somebody that had worked with Venezuela, that Venezuela seemed to admire and have confidence in. And that process went on from the beginning of 2017 to the beginning of 2018. There was a process of enhanced mediation, which is dialogue. When Mr. Maduro calls for dialogue, he conveniently omits the fact that an exercise that was meant to be intensification of good offices ended as recently as the beginning of 2018. And it showed that the two sides were unable to arrive at an agreement. But more worrying the two sides were growing farther apart rather than finding common ground. And for that reason, Doug Newlander and the Secretary General jointly agreed to send the matter to the court. So that is why good offices was abandoned. But the point is that the end of the good offices was part of the process that the SG supervised. Given what had happened, you are talking good offices from 1990. From 1990 until now, and it wasn't yielding anything. The Secretary General had to respond to Guyana's call for a definitive resolution of the problem. Good offices does not provide any definitive resolution if it couldn't have done it in 30 years. And so the SG agreed to move from good offices to the court. And that is how we got here. Good offices, intensified good offices, intensified mediation, then the court. But Venezuela wants to turn the clock back so that it can play the game that it has been playing in the past.
You mentioned earlier that if the ICJ rule in Guyana's favor and Venezuela don't adhere to the ruling, Guyana can take its case to the Security Council. But the Security Council has 5 permanent members who can veto. Anyone can veto anything.
Right. Well, I don't have any reason to assume at this stage that they're necessarily going to veto the Security Council, that the Security Council has members that inherently or will automatically veto an attempt to stop Venezuela from either attacking or harassing Guyana in this way. Remember that China has investments in the Stabroek block. The US has extensive investment there. The United Kingdom has firms that have been involved not necessarily in the Stabroek block, but in Guyana's EZ. And we don't have any reason to assume that although the UK is not a party, that they will just sit and take action that is inimical to Guyana's interests. The question then, who is it you think might do this? Russia has been at pains when we've spoken to them in the past to say that they do not have a case against Guyana. Russia has no problem with Guyana. And that at one point at least, arguing that the party should respect the decision of the ICJ. Russian representatives have said this at some point. So I don't know at this point whether one would be reasonable to conclude that they wouldn't live with that. And again, China has to work with them.
But China also has massive investments in Venezuela. But when I say, you mentioned the right country there. Mm-hmm. Pardon me?
I said those are not quite active in the same way.
Right.
It is true that they have massive investments there. Something of 50 billion was being tossed around in 2015, 2016 as being the indebtedness of Venezuela to China.
Right. But you mentioned Russia. Russia maybe said, and that was maybe a few years back, that it will go with what the ICJ says. But given the United States and Russia clashing over the Ukrainian war, Russia will just want to get back at the United States to say, I'm going to veto this because the United States will be the one to put this resolution through. And Russia might just say, I'm going to veto it just to spite not Guyana, but to spite Russia, right?
Well, that is possible, but Russia has to look at its interests in a holistic way. And I don't know that one can conclude definitively that it will, in those circumstances, veto. We have diplomatic work to do, but we have to work on them to ensure that they know that we will try to encourage the developing states as well as the OECD states and even Russia's allies to look after our interests. So you see, the thing is, you have to make a potential opponent recognize that doing something unhelpful to you could be costly. That's the challenge faced by the Foreign Service. And, you know, I would hope that the minister would muster his people to be able to do that.
President Ali has done an excellent job in informing the international community about Venezuela threats,
yes,
the referendum and everything else. And Prime Minister Phillips just last week was at the OAS address updating them on Venezuela threats as well, which are brilliant. But some people are saying that the people in Guyana, especially in the rural parts, don't have a clue of what's going on. They have not been told anything much what's going on with Venezuela and Guyana right now. Now, I don't know if the Guyana government is going to address this issue or not, but do you think, go ahead.
Well, there was a heads of mission, or those who are acting as heads of mission 2 weeks ago, and also last week in discussions at the level of the advisory committee, an assurance was being given that work in that regard will be accelerated because we realize the dangers that situation you describe poses. One has to wait to see what that means on the ground and the extent to which it's accelerated.
Given all that was going on in the world today, the war in the Middle East, Israel, Palestinian, Hamas, and so forth, Russia, Ukraine. Now, does the world want to see
Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Right. But does the world want to see, well, we can go to Qatar and those countries too, but does the world want to see another country, another two countries get involved in a bitter struggle over land?
I wouldn't have thought so, but you know, countries are led by people. And sometimes the reaction to situations is not always predictable and it isn't always rational. And that is why I emphasize the work of the Foreign Service. It is to make these people aware that it's not in their interest to see you harmed. And that requires a commitment, requires resources, requires attention. I don't think we do it steadily enough, but let us hope that the government, having recognized the dangers, will do so going forward.
You know as well as I do that most border disputes have ended in wars. I'm not saying the Guyana-Venezuela border dispute will end in wars, but most have ended in wars. And wars seem to be the only solution to end border disputes. Diplomacy has failed in many, many countries, with the exception of 2 or 3. So
no, I would say that in many cases it has led to conflict. A war is something that perhaps would engulf a significant army or significant part of the country. But in some instances, people have recognized conflicts are costly and they bring that to an end. So let us hope that good sense will come to prevail in that regard. This is not as comfortable a world for many of the countries in it as was the case 5 years ago. The economic prospects are not quite the same. And so just entering into a war, dissipating resources or wasting them in an unproductive way like this is probably something that many people would want a government to think twice about before it moves in that direction.
So why do you think that diplomacy will work in this case?
It has to work because that is all that's available to you. You have therefore to apply it more intensively and to make people aware of the costs.
Is it true that Venezuela is building a land airstrip at the border, on its side of the border, and of Ghana's troops up there?
Yes, we believe that that is happening.
And what has been Guyana's response?
Well, I don't know what is done on the military side in terms of safeguards, but we have, of course, drawn it to the attention of the UN and, of course, the court, because it isn't a secret.
Now, when you were the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Venezuela question came up then, during the Granger administration, and it died away. What did you do to cause Venezuela to back off? Or what did AP do?
We did a lot of work with our partners. Of course, there was an ambassador there. There had been an ambassador there from 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Cheryl Miles,
Right.
one of our most experienced ambassadors, and this, the situation was different. So you had a different administration in Brazil. We spoke to them. They were asking about what was going on. We worked with our allies in the region, which would include Colombia, as well as the Caribbean. The Caribbean in 2016 sent a letter to Mr. Maduro telling him that the Caribbean is entitled to their patrimony and that the attempt by decree to seize Guyana's EZ was not acceptable, because we also drew to their attention. I mean, not much is being made of that now, but the claim that Venezuela has on our maritime space is part of a wider claim to the territory of 9 other Caribbean territories, 9 Caribbean territories. It's not just about Guyana. And that is why the region has to wake up and pay attention to what's going on. A man or a country may give you material assistance now, but the fact that they have designs on your territory ought not to miss you. And you shouldn't have to be reminding the Caribbean of this all the time, but unfortunately, that is the situation.
I know it took an island away from Trinidad years ago, one from Grenada. It also took part, I think, Colombia, a piece of Colombia's territory, and so forth. So Venezuela has not been new at this. And it is the belief that Venezuela will one part of Guyana, especially because of the oil reserves and the mining and everything in Essequibo.
Yeah.
Now, this has been the basic feeling of the Maduro regime, that 11 billion barrels of oil belongs to Trinidad, belongs to Venezuela. Now, my question to you is this. When this is played out in front of the International Court, and when this is played out next week in front of the court, ICJ again, due to the referendum, what the ICJ can possibly do if Venezuela is not in the court or have not responded to any of the ICJ requests to be present?
No, I don't assume they will not be there, I mean, they have so far used the opportunity when offered by the court to defend themselves or to say what they want to. Don't forget, you're in the merits phase, and they have actually joined the merits phase by lodging some preliminary objections. Do you remember?
Right, yeah.
And the court was not in favor of those preliminary objections. So I would think that they're likely to attend the meeting.
Mr. Greenwich, the arbitral award is 124 years old.
Yes.
And it's sickening today that we have the same problem going back to them. Who is to say that Venezuela will stop now? Venezuela might back off, but 2 years down the road, might raise the issue again.
Well, I have not suggested to anybody that this problem will disappear completely in the near future. I think one would be very brave to suggest that to them. Venezuela's strategy is partly a strategy of attrition, to hope that eventually Guyanese will get fed up, or to make it drag out so long and so expensively that Guyana and its people will lose interest. But the point is that you are claiming, in our papers, I don't know why we insist on saying that, Venezuela is claiming over 74% of the landmass.
Right.
It's not 2%, it's not a little island.
2/3.
It's over 74, over 2/3, nearly
Right.
3/4, practically 3/4. It's a lot. It is very unusual in international disputes for one country to claim such a large part of another, especially when it has never actually ruled that country. It has never, for a single day, had control over, even if they say they had a dominion for some area. It has never been a significant proportion. From 1648, the Dutch were in control.
Right. Now, so Venezuela claim it will be coming all the way down to Perica. So just Demerara and Berbice will remain as Guyana's territory?
Well, Demerara and Berbice are good enough. You know, in the past, the success of what was these territories was to be found in Essequibo and Berbice, or Essequibo and Demerara. But after a while, Demerara and Berbice overtook it. And that's how come Essequibo was self-linked to Demerara and treated as the two rivers. Remember, right. It was called the two rivers.
Right.
Because it ceased to be as important as it had been initially. But I don't give any thought to trying to survive without Essequibo, because this is our territory and we will not give it up.
Well, President Ali says not a square inch, and he strongly depends on the people and the defense forces to repel any action by Venezuela. Given that, though, I think if Venezuela, well, I strongly believe that Venezuela will not invade. It's just Maduro is trying to play a game here. But if Venezuela is to invade or annex part of Guyana's territory, it might not annex the entire Essequibo region, but annex part of it, especially where the oil region is. What do we do?
Well, I don't see them being successful in that regard. I don't see anybody, least of all the US, allowing Venezuela to seize the assets that lie largely offshore.
Right.
You can't get, I mean, the US is itself a major trading and maritime power. And I think that Venezuela would be rather foolhardy to start off by trying just to seize the maritime resources. And the question is it worth your while to go to the trouble to seize the land resources, land territory, if you're not going to get access to the maritime resources? You get to a lot of trouble, but you wouldn't get a reward that would have made it worth your while.
Mr. Grenius, can you tell us what you think is the best solution?
No, there's no perfect solution. You ramp up the work of your diplomatic corps, you strengthen it by bringing skills in, training them, encouraging them. You got to pay attention to their pay attention to skill levels, and make sure that their outreach, their diplomatic efforts, is as wide and intense as possible across the globe, with friends and non-friends alike. But you know, we have a tendency to feel, I mean, not only as a government, but as a public, that, you know, it's a good life for ambassadors. You don't really need to bother them. But you need to get ambassadors in place. You need to get skilled people in the position as ambassadors, and they need to be working around the clock. You got, this is your first line of defense, it's also your last line of defense. That's the most effective means at your disposal. And even in the case of some place like Ukraine, just look at how they're operating. You can see how effective they have been in mobilizing assistance for Ukraine. It may not be in soldiers, because nobody wants to give up the lives of their citizens, but certainly in terms of equipment, technology, information, you can do a lot in that regard. That is what we have to concentrate on.
As you know, Venezuela has been prodding the Arab nations. Maduro has gone to many of them and so forth. Guyana now has an embassy in Qatar, one in Kuwait, and so forth. Has the Guyana government been doing anything to get these nations support?
Well, with respect to those two countries, I believe they have. That is what I've been told by the foreign ministry. How much wider in the Arab world, I can't say. But what I can say to you is that when this government was in administration before, it had initiated actions which were followed by the Granger government to lobby and work with the Islamic organization, the IOC, as well as to participate in the Saudi Arabia Latin America Forum, which meets periodically and is an effective forum for exchanging information and building allies with the Arab side. I would hope that the government will continue with that effort, because it's important.
You mentioned that the date has been set by the High Court for the case. What is that date? For the ICJ, for the
14th and 15th.
No, that's for the referendum, but I'm talking about the case of itself, the border dispute case.
No, there's no, what they've asked Venezuela to do is to submit by the date I gave you. And assuming that Venezuela is not given leave to change the date, then normally a hearing will take place on that very day or close to it. And that date was the 8th of March 2014, I believe.
2024, you mean?
Sorry, 2024.
And when Guyana has to submit?
At this point in time, no date for Guyana submission that I can recall.
So this means that if March, then Guyana would have to submit, that will be another 2-3 months. So we go into the half of next year. And
yes, that's most likely, yeah.
And this matter will still not be resolved.
You're dealing in the second half of next year.
Now,
for the terminal phase.
We had a border dispute with Suriname, and that was settled by the High Court, by the ICJ. And Suriname accepted that decision.
That was on the maritime side, yes.
Right. So Venezuela seems to be a bully because it knows it has military might. So don't you think that Guyana should build up its military capabilities as well?
Well, it needs to do so. Military preparation is very expensive, especially today when men are using all types of sophisticated equipment, which has been generated by the digital and telecommunications revolution. It's become very, very expensive. It means that for smaller states, they can be involved in the technology, the military technology, but that involvement is expensive. Whether it is drones or electronic surveillance, it is costly. And maybe the big countries don't have the advantages they once did. As you can see, Ukraine has been pretty effective in that regard. And Azerbaijan, in the fight against Armenia, was able to use drones and electronic equipment to its advantage. And it is there that the Lebanese seem to have so impressed the Israelis that the Israelis have to call the United States to send aircraft carriers to protect them on that front.
Now,
so you can invest in that too, if you wish.
But Ghana don't have the manpower to counter Venezuela's manpower because
no, but no, you don't. You don't. But the electronic and digital revolution on the telecommunication side can enable you to do a lot of things. For instance, you can monitor what is happening on your EZ. You don't have to have 90 warships. You might have to have 90 drones. And you therefore will have to have men who will monitor those drones. But the problem is not the men for something like that at this point in time. It's the training of the people. It's developing the skills and holding on to them. And that is where we have failed and have not yet done much in that regard.
Let me ask you this question. I don't even know it. But why Venezuela think that Essequibo belongs to them?
Well, we believe initially this had to do maybe with strategic concerns. They were afraid of Cuba. They were afraid of our links with Cuba.
No, but this is going back before 1899.
Before 1890? No,
Yeah.
well, before 1899, of course, Venezuela is a little outrageous in this claim because Venezuela has never governed Essequibo. It was Spain's territory,
Right.
and Spain lost it to the Netherlands.
Right.
In 1814, it was handed over to Britain, and Venezuela was hoping somehow that they would have gotten it, but it was never their territory. So they saw it perhaps as a missed opportunity, and they keep selling it as a place fantastic in resources, including uranium. And so they're concerned that they should never have lost that opportunity. But you know, there are many opportunities you lose that you don't ever regain.
As you said, this was handed over to the Netherlands, then the British took control of it. So my question then, why the British entertain an arbitrary award to set up a commission to discuss?
United States. The United States. The United States was happy to keep out of the story. Venezuela attracted and persuaded the US by paying by encouraging some senators to undertake investment in the Orinoco. I don't know if you recall, there was a book, what was it called? Published called Empire on the Orinoco.
Okay.
And a whole set of American investors were organized to invest there. Of course, the US, once it sees something like that going on, will intervene to protect its investors. The representative that Venezuela sent to lobbyists, the Americans sent to work on the President Cleveland and others, was able to exert an influence. He was an American. He had connections. He'd been a former, I think, congressman himself. He was a lawyer, and therefore was able to make the connections. And I suppose that is a coincidence, but he did have an impact.
But Britain at the time was a powerful country. I think more powerful than the United States.
It was more powerful than the United States, but although it was not as powerful as although it was more powerful, it has lost a war of independence.
Right.
And it subsequently lost a number of smaller wars and skirmishes because, of course, Britain was tied up elsewhere. Southern Africa, Asia, a whole set of other places. They were fighting on too many fronts. As you see, the US itself is finding that with all the tremendous might it has, all the aircraft carriers that now convert international waters almost into a forward base.
Right.
Well, into a forward base. It still can't take on too many opponents. It claims it could fight, I think, as much as 5 wars at once, but you know, that is a theoretical possibility. In reality, it leaves no room for any mistake.
So, going back to 124 years, we drag it out. We had the Geneva Agreement. We went further. And since then, there's been no other agreement.
No, and we don't want another agreement because the intention of Venezuela on these agreements is attrition. Stretch you out again. And as the SG found, the exercise that he begins with, so you start off with an exercise which says there's a dispute over this region. We don't want it all back, but it was a humiliation for us, so we want that remedied. That's how it started. You go to the UN Secretary General with that story in 1966, and by 1990, and then by 2016, you've added all sorts of other problems to that. It is now the whole Essequibo that you want. It is now the exclusive economic zone of Guyana that you want. It is now a claim that there's an American base in the Essequibo that you have to fix, and stuff like that. So what has happened is the area over which the tension has arisen is widening.
President Ali and Prime Minister have done a very good job in keeping the pressure on Venezuela. But given what's happening in the world today, the United States is indulged in the war with Ukraine and Russia, now the Middle East with Israel and so forth. Do you think that less attention is being paid to Venezuela by the other international? Well, Europe, the European Union also involved in Russia. They're also involved in the Middle East. All the countries that are involved in those 2 wars.
Because these are alliances. What you have today are alliances. That's why your diplomatic work must take that into account. You can't operate on your own. You have to find allies. And there are many fronts on which you have not got allies that you could make better case of. As you were saying, the Arab countries, whether they be oil producers or not, Southeast Asia, you got to do more with. As you are doing things, the US is, India is building closer links with some of the countries in the region that are problematic. Guatemala, Venezuela, for example. You should not be sitting idly by and allowing that to take place, because India has been a major supporter in the past. Will it remain that way? Other things are happening. So you have to make things happen for you too.
Well, yeah, I know this, and the Ghana government is doing a very good job. But the question is that I don't know, given what's taking place in the world today, those countries have taken priority over the Venezuela-Guyana border dispute.
But that is only because you've allowed it to happen. You got to work on them. You got to keep reminding them all the time. You don't intervene once and fix it and it remains fixed. It is a constant process. That's why diplomats have been in existence for so long. We speak about prostitutes being the first profession. But you know, diplomacy is not far behind, if it's behind at all. And it was often tied up with that first profession too.
I agree, diplomacy works, but in this case, I think one of our best allies will be Brazil, because Brazil is a military and economic powerhouse.
But I don't doubt that. Up to this afternoon, I was saying that in another forum, having been prompted by Dr. Curtin. It is true, but somehow we seem not to have made the bonds there that we should. And right now, there's no ambassador in Brasilia, which cannot be helpful.
We don't have an ambassador in Brazil. We don't have an ambassador in Venezuela either.
Well, the one has been named.
I know one has been named, but is he there as yet?
No, he's not there as yet because Venezuela hasn't issued or approved the agremo. And we don't know whether they will.
But there's a Venezuelan ambassador in Guyana.
Correct.
Yeah, I think Brazil because Brazil don't like what Venezuela is doing. From all angles, from what I'm reading, Brazil thoroughly opposes what Venezuela is doing. And Brazil will not hesitate to make sure that Venezuela stay in its corner. But are we making overtures to Brazil? I don't even know at this stage.
Yeah, I have not been involved in work on that front. So I can't say.
So we have about 6 or 8 minutes before coming to the end of the program. What can you tell our listeners and tell the people of Guyana and broadcasting the Caribbean all over the world? You think the steps Guyana should take to thwart Venezuela's claim, and what the future holds for the border dispute?
Well, the steps that should be taken are fairly obvious. I think one has to widen the scope of one's diplomatic initiatives to include groups outside of the traditional allies we've worked with. And we have to deepen our work with all of them, making them aware that there is now a military threat. And to the extent that they make their disapproval evident, then Venezuela will be discouraged from going forward with any military action or any hostile action of that kind. So that is what has to. There's no shortcut. There is no way that you can get around that. You have to invest, and I don't mean only cash-wise, but you have to invest in strengthening your diplomatic service, working with the skills you have, bringing in skills. And today you have to be looking at a wide range of skills, more languages, people with skills on the technical front. You got to collaborate even by way of economic assistance. One of the ways that Venezuela has made outreach to many of the countries we know in the Southeast Asia, for example, is with economic cooperation and aid. They're sending teachers of Spanish to these countries, and the teachers of Spanish are going to these areas with a message about what Venezuela's territorial growth is. That is the main focus that we have to undertake, so as to ensure that we can be protected from the immediate hazards. Now, in the longer term, I think you have to make these sorts of interventions by Venezuela costly for them, so that they lose friends, and that, you know, if you have economic arrangements with them, they have to think about the cost. Think about the cost to allies who they have and who are currently operating in Guyana. You got to work with China on that. You got to work with China on that.
Do you think the European Union will impose any sanctions on Venezuela should it incur on Guyana's border?
I think if you get military action, the European Union will do that. But maybe a more effective response would be to signal that beforehand, so that they don't go in that direction.
That's true.
But we have actually to do more work with the ACP group. The European Union doesn't operate in a vacuum.
Right.
We are important members of the ACP group.
That's right. Yeah.
The OACP now, and therefore we have to use to a maximum the leverage we have there. Sending skills, appointing diplomats there, getting an ambassador based in Brussels who is familiar with issues to do with the European Union and can operate across the spread of countries. Sending other officers in support, because it's 27 countries you're dealing with, not one. And they're not small like that.
Prime Minister Rowley signed a gas agreement with Venezuela, and I've also read where Miyamoti made comments, but her comments tells me that she was, and I have tremendous respect for her, but her comments tells me that she did not understand the scope of what's going on, because she made the comments in such a way that Guyana is to be blamed as well for what Venezuela is doing. So I don't understand CARICOM support in all of this. With Trinidad and Barbados at this stage, I really don't. Well, the other countries, they pour the support strongly behind Guyana, Jamaica, the smaller islands, and everything else. But Barbados, multi-statement, I'm aghast at that. And Rowley now signed an agreement with Trinidad, and he's lying low.
With Venezuela, you mean?
With Venezuela,
yeah.
And he's lying low at this stage.
Well, if he has an urgent economic need and a commitment with Venezuela, one can understand that he's not going to be shouting from the rooftops, and that to me is okay. But you also need to explore cooperation agreements with these countries. You follow?
Right.
There's no reason why you can't. We talk the talk, but do we deliver? And the same thing applies to Brazil. Over the years, we talk a lot about this. We were talking about to Barbados, maybe not so much to Trinidad. Instead of speaking with Trinidad, we were in an exchange that was more like a war. So you can't be unaware that sort of tone between two countries is not going to lead to a situation where the leaders are going to be enthusiastic about coming out in your defense. You have to remember all of that.
I spoke to Dr. Avery Brown, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Trinidad of Barbados, and I told him, he said he's not aware of the speech. He will have to look it over and get back to me. But that I know that's just a cop-out. He has to be aware of the speech. Anyway, Mr. Greenett, any closing remarks? We're coming to the end of the program.
No, I thank you again for the opportunity to explore this issue again. It certainly is a burning issue in Guyana. I've just come from a forum established by or set up by the university, and the response was surprising to the Vice Chancellor. The range of people that attended and the scope of the questions surprised me. So Guyanese are becoming aware of the danger that confronts us. And
Right.
Guyanese in the street, as well as Guyanese at the diplomatic level and the direct political directorate, have a role to play in ensuring we can confront Venezuela in this regard. And we need to think carefully about how best we play that role.
I agree with that. And as I said, President Ali has done an excellent job, and Prime Minister Phillips did an excellent job at the OAS there. I read his statement, and you can't ask for anything better than that. But we have to now, as you said, continue.
That's right. It's not a one-off exercise. It's
Right.
not
We
a
have to
single point
continue.
exercise.
That is true.
Yeah.
No.
And
We have to
it's
continue.
not to be done by presidents and prime ministers alone. This is something I hate to have to reiterate so often. Diplomacy is not about a president and a prime minister alone,
True.
or primarily. You got to have a diplomatic service that works,
That's true.
and you
That
got
is
to
so
have
true.
ordinary people that also sell your messages when they travel, when they are visiting. There's a lot of work to be done. When you confront with a problem like this, you got to invest time and resources and systematically craft and send out your message. And
I agree with you. Go ahead.
No, I was saying I hope we've done our little bit in that regard this evening.
I agree with you, and I strongly believe in diplomacy over conflicts or wars, because diplomacy is much better than to have people killed and what have you. So I hope we can continue using the diplomatic route and get this problem settled once and for all. And I hope Venezuela accept the international court's ruling whenever that ruling is made. Thank you very much, Mr. Greenwich, and it's been a pleasure having you here tonight. I must congratulate you for the job you've been doing, and I'm sure you're going to be in Geneva. The High Court, where is it again? In
The Hague,
The Hague.
Netherlands.
Next week to fight on behalf of Guyana. That's something that I'm very proud of you for doing, and everything else, and all the lawyers and all the legal people there. And I hope Venezuela attended that meeting, or that.
And they will attend. Yeah.
Good.
The hearing.
So thank you once again, and thanks to all our listeners for a program, and thanks to Noir Singh, Devin Bissoon, and Ryan Gobe, and thanks to everybody again, once and for all. Thank you very much, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you. I join you in extending thanks.